Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all to this seventh webinar on COVID-19 Cultural Response Forum organized by Delhi Comparatist. We'll start with the introduction by Anam of Delhi Comparatist. So, Anam, over to you.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Abhishek. Now I'm going to introduce Delhi Comparatives to those who are new to this platform. Delhi Comparatives is basically an academic group established by a group of students and teachers of University of Delhi. It aims to study Indian literary scenario through the prism of transmediality and interdisciplinarity. Our core focus is to develop a critical understanding of social and political dynamics of multicultural Indian landscape. Our various events, research projects, and collaboration embrace themes like Delhi comparative studies, literary historiography, transmediality, pluralistic epistemology, marginocentrism, spatiality, digital humanities, etc. We endeavor to create a sustainable and socially relevant hub to engage with and enhance the tools, methodology, theory, and epistemology approaches pertaining these dynamically interactive areas of study. So today's webinar is also organized by one of our subgroups of Delhi Comparatives, namely COVID-19 Culture Archiving and Research Forum. This group is coordinated by our coordinator Saheb Kaur. And now I would like to request Saheb to introduce the forum to our participants and guests. Thank you so much. Over to you, Saheb.
Thanks, Anam. A very good morning to you all. Let me just proceed with the basic of what our forum does. COVID-19, we all know, has been undeniably affected not just the health sector, but our society at large. And our COVID-19 Research and Archiving Forum focuses on analyzing these cultural shifts while keeping in mind the core vision of Delhi Comparatists. It is a collaboration between Delhi Comparatists and Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan, under which we have recently completed the project on Muslim community response to COVID-19 in India. We aspire to research, rethink, as well as archive important cultural responses that are multidisciplinary in regards to data collection and approaches. Hence, today's webinar welcomes all the more important for all of us to understand the dynamics of multi-layered society and how these shifts have instigated a new cultural schema, reality, and a language in various sectors like education, economics, geopolitics, and so on. Our current project of archiving COVID in India is in collaboration with Design, Beku, and Tattle. They are digital archiving organizations. And furthermore, our current book project is to understand these shifts in the Indian cultural landscape and is also in collaboration with the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And we have had 7 webinars so far, and each of that webinar has given us valuable insights into the sudden and advertent relations and experiences during the pandemic and is likely to persist post-COVID-19 as well. So we welcome you all, and over to you, Anam.
Okay, I'm sorry about the video. There's some problem with the video. So today we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Dilip Kumar Das. Dr. Dilip Kumar Das teaches cultural studies in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at English and Foreign Languages, University, Hyderabad. So his specialization is in the body studies and critical medical humanities. Among his various publications, the latest publication is a book on AIDS awareness campaigns in India titled Teaching AIDS, The Cultural Politics of HIV Disease in India, published by Springer in 2019. Currently, he's also working on a book on epidemic narratives. So I welcome you, sir, to the Delhi Comparatives platform, and I welcome you to start your lecture. We will gather some very valuable insights today from you. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Abhishek. I don't ordinarily prefer online talks or webinars because I'm not very comfortable with the technology. And this was something very interesting. And so I thought this would perhaps be a very good opportunity for me to share some of my ideas. And with that, let me thank you all for inviting me here. There again, I can't see you. Let me thank you all for inviting me here. And I hope I make sense. Some of you may have caught the allusion in my title. There again, it's gone. What's happened? Yeah. You may have caught the allusion in my title. Against the urgency of people dying in the streets, why in God's name cultural studies? In an essay on the relevance of cultural studies, which he wrote in the 1990s, in the thick of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Stuart Hall actually asks that very pertinent question in a slightly different phrasing. He writes, with the urgency of people dying in the streets, what in God's name is the point of cultural studies? I think today we are facing the same question. The disease may be different, but I think the urgency is the same. What is cultural studies all about? And in what ways can it enable us to deal with AIDS or COVID? You know, as they say of Emperor Nero, is it just fiddling while the world burns? Now, what I will present before you is the way I understand and practice cultural studies. As Hall states in the same essay from which I've taken my title, as Hall says, there are different versions of doing cultural studies. And therefore, what I present to you is only one version. So let me begin this discussion on method in cultural studies with its relation to the disciplines it draws on and from which it is distinguished. You know that one of the origins of cultural studies was in the 70s, the University of Birmingham, UK, in the work of Raymond Williams, Richard Hoggart, and Stuart Hall. And that work begins in departments of literature. Both Williams and Hoggart, who in a sense founded the new field of inquiry, belong to the Department of English. And I remember reading when when Hoggart's book, The Use of Literacy, was published, there was a tremendous reaction from the sociology department. What is this fellow doing? He has no understanding of sociology. He is trained in literary methods. And what the hell is he trying to prove? And there was an attempt by some of the faculty to even get the university to close down the center because it was doing very spurious work, in their opinion. So let me start with this question of literary studies. Cultural studies draws from literary studies. What does it draw from that? It draws its method of analysis. Like literary studies, cultural studies is concerned about meaning, about how texts produce meaning. Unlike literary studies, however, cultural studies is not about the formal and the aesthetic properties of texts. It is about texts and their social contexts. On the other side, we have the social sciences. Hoggart's uses of literacy, the use of literacy was actually trying to combine sociology, and literary studies. Like the social sciences, from which it draws much of its conceptual apparatus. Now, the distinction I'm making here is that the analytical method comes from the humanities, from the disciplines that deal with the production of meaning. The conceptual comes from the social sciences. Like the social sciences, from which it draws much of its conceptual apparatus, it looks at social formations and the underlying structures that shape them. But in terms of the meanings or significances that we attribute to these structures. In other words, cultural studies attempts to link representation of the social world with the structures of class, caste, gender, race, etc., on which it comes to be organized. And it does this in order to bring to light the relations of power and resistance, of course, that both reproduce and transform the social world. It examines the ways in which cultural practices are deployed in power relations and the effects they produce in specific contexts, both interpersonal and institutional. Cultural studies, as Hall famously put it, and this is one of those quotes about cultural studies that is kind of widely circulated. Cultural studies, he said, is politics by other means. And at the center of this analysis is the question of how we are constituted as subjects of this politics in both senses of the word subject, subjected to it as well as the agents of its deployment. That, in a nutshell, is how I understand the project of cultural studies. The politics of how we constitute, represent, perpetuate, or transform the social formations within which we are nonetheless positioned. In other words, the triangle of discourse, power, and subject formation. What does culture in cultural studies mean? I think cultural studies draws simultaneously on two concepts of culture. The first as a site of meaning, as in the humanities, and the second as a way of being, as in the social sciences. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz put this succinctly when he wrote in The Interpretation of Cultures that culture is, and I'm quoting from Geertz, the webs of significance in which we are suspended, and the imaginative universe in which our acts function as signs. Culture constitutes the practices that we engage in and the norms that structure these practices and are in turn restructured by them. It is also the meanings we attribute to the norms and practices in the way we represent them. In an essay titled Toward a Genealogy of the State of Cultural Studies, which I think is a very important essay on the methods of cultural studies, Lawrence Grossberg writes that it attempts to map or reconstruct, and I'm quoting from Grossberg, to map or reconstruct the relations between discourses, everyday life, and the machineries of power, unquote. The object of cultural studies, therefore, is not culture as such, but the contexts in which culture and power converge. And epidemic outbreak, as we know, is one such context. Let me now turn to the question of method in cultural studies. As you know, every discipline must have a clearly defined object and a coherent set of concepts and analytical methods by which it can be approached. I think one of the most illuminating texts, as far as this is concerned, is that very well known but not so well read book by Ferdinand de Saussure called A Course in General Linguistics. Saussure begins his proposal for linguistics as a discipline, as a scientific discipline, with precisely this question. What is the object of linguistics, he asks. Why is it that langue or structure must be the object of linguistics and not parole? Because parole is many faceted. There are many different ways from which we can study it. We can study it from the point of view of psychology, from the perspective of phonology, from the perspective of the acoustics, etc., etc. And therefore, it's not really possible to consider it as a unified object. Only the structure of language, langue, is a unified object. And he kind of points to, the ways in which disciplinary fields come to be constituted. So what is fundamental to a discipline is a unified object, a singular object, and the legitimate procedures of theorizing and analyzing this object. I emphasize the word legitimate. These are procedures that are clearly laid down, defined, in disciplinary methodologies. Now, in this context, cultural studies is considered to be an interdisciplinary field of inquiry. The term interdisciplinarity is commonly understood to mean a method that combines two or more disciplines in studying an object that is common to them. Thus, medical geography is an interdisciplinary subdiscipline of geography that examines the spatial distributions of disease in relation to natural and social environments. But I think that the interdisciplinary method of cultural studies functions quite differently from this. It works in the boundaries of disciplines. To rework and even undermine these boundaries, to point to their limits, and to bring forth new knowledge. To put it rhetorically, the interdisciplinarity of cultural studies is its methodological tendency to indiscipline. Let me explain what I mean by this. Take disease as an object. It is the legitimate object of the discipline of medicine, which frames appropriate questions for studying it. What is the cause? What are its effects? How can it be reversed or arrested? What is the prognosis, etc. But to ask what the contexts are in which disease becomes a focus of power relations, or how disease becomes a site of governmentality, is to ask questions that are both inappropriate to the object and illegitimate to its proper inquiry. Quite often, after I have made a presentation on HIV/AIDS or some other disease like leprosy, I've often been asked a question by members of the audience. What is a teacher of humanities doing with something like health and disease? What are my credentials for talking about disease? In fact, I think I must mention this. One of my vice chancellors at the university where I work, long back, not now, once asked this very same question regarding a course that I was offering on the cultural context of disease. He asked this in a meeting of another department, in which obviously I was not a member and therefore not present. He asked, is he a doctor? How can he talk about disease? How can he teach about disease? What does he know about disease? To be fair to him, this revered vice chancellor was a professor of Russian language and therefore understandably did not keep himself abreast of some of the later developments in critical humanities. But then as far as that is concerned, I don't think nowadays vice chancellors are actually noted for their intellectual acumen. And so I quite understand his question and where it was coming from. Now, to get back to my presentation, it is in this breach of propriety, asking improper questions, setting improper ways of analyzing, appropriating or misappropriating an object that is proper to a different discipline. It is in this breach of propriety that crucial insights into medical power open up, which the disciplines cannot bring to light because they challenge their very boundaries. It is with this in mind, I think, that Lawrence Grossberg, in the essay I referred to, claims that cultural studies is not about objects, it is about contexts. In drawing opportunistically on various disciplines, its objective is to, and I quote from Grossberg, gain whatever knowledge is necessary to map a particular context and answer a strategic question. It is in the breach of propriety that the critical edge of cultural studies lies. With these preliminary observations on cultural studies as a field of critical inquiry, let me now turn to the object of epidemic disease. In what follows, I will try to sketch in outline what questions a cultural studies approach asks and what methods it uses. An epidemic is defined as a sudden outbreak of infectious disease that spreads rapidly and affects a large number of people. A pandemic is an epidemic that spreads across a number of different geographical locations, a number of different countries. Epidemics and pandemics are studied from a number of different disciplinary perspectives as objects of public health medicine, economics, geography, history, sociology, health communication, etc. All of these presuppose the objectivity of epidemic as an event. It is something that is assumed to exist quite independently of how we understand and explain it. A cultural studies approach begins by questioning this presupposition. How do these different disciplinary discourses construct epidemic as a significant event? Or what meanings do they attribute to epidemic? What are the stories we tell of COVID-19? And how do we construct it? how do these constructions influence the ways in which we respond to it and to people affected by COVID-19? These are the questions that cultural studies asks. Now, to digress a little, uh, when I was reading through the list of topics that Abhishek sent to me about this project on COVID-19, there was one thing I noticed. There wasn't a topic on the representation of COVID-19. These topics, to my mind, seem to assume that there is something called COVID-19. It's a given objective social reality, and that we can study its effects on various populations like Jains, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, transgenders, women, men, in very empirical ways. I think we need to ask that fundamental question. Not what is COVID-19 as an objective event, but how is COVID-19 constructed as an objective event? How is it constructed? In what kind of discourses? How is it constructed in the medical reports that we have, in the stories and videos that it has generated? Now, this semester, I was teaching a course called Epidemic Narratives. And when I looked into the internet for narratives about the COVID epidemic, believe me, I mean, there are countless stories, videos, blogs, whatnot, countless stories, media stories. It was very interesting to look at the ways in which these different stories actually constructed the narrative. Let me just give you an example. There was one video, I think produced by a Canadian broadcasting company, which is called the COVID timeline. So it begins December 31st, the outbreak in Wuhan, and then takes us gradually, I think, up to March 27th or something, a kind of day-by-day account. So you have visuals and the dateline and a kind of caption at the bottom in the style of newspaper headlines, constructing the event as an objective reality. Now, compare that with another video that was there on YouTube, which was produced by the BBC's, the British Broadcasting Corporation's Hindi service. This was a video on a comparable epidemic that happened 100 years back, precisely 100 years back, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1920, in which also a very large number of people died, and which was also an influenza epidemic, like COVID, a respiratory disease epidemic. Now, how does this video begin? It begins with a kind of an enactment of a passage from a memoir written by the Hindi poet Nirala, Suryakant Tripathi. This is from his memoir, Kuli Bhat, where Nirala is talking about 1918 and the epidemic, when many members of his family died, and there was large-scale suffering and the kind of impact it had on him. So it begins with that. And then goes on to give us a kind of timeline of the Spanish flu epidemic. But it frames the epidemic no longer as an objective event out there, which is to be scientifically studied, but as something that has tremendous subjective consequences for us. So there are different ways in which we tell the story of epidemic. What kind of meanings do these different ways generate? In what ways do those meanings shape our strategic responses to epidemic? I think these are the questions that cultural studies would ask. Now, as far as any disease is concerned, the naming of a disease is, I think, a very crucial factor in the way in which we understand and respond to it. Why is it that the present epidemic was named COVID-19? Some of you may have seen that announcement by the Director General of the World Health Organization. I think it was on 11th February 2020, when Ghebreyesus announced that this epidemic or this disease will be called coronavirus disease 2019, short COVID-19, as per the protocols laid down by the World Health Organization. Why was it not called Chinese flu? When the other epidemic 100 years back came to be called the Spanish flu, even though the epidemic did not originate in Spain, it actually originated in the United States. Spain was the first country to publicly acknowledge it. President Donald Trump, you may recall, in an important speech, talked about what he called the Chinese virus with reference to COVID-19. What were the implications of that phrase, Chinese virus? In what geopolitical context was the remark made? What was the consequence of that with regard to the fate of countless Chinese Americans in the United States and of Asian Americans generally, especially people from China, Japan, and the eastern part? What is the difference between the term leprosy and the term Hansen's disease? Why was it that at a certain point of time, the word leprosy came to be removed from the register of medicine and was replaced by the term Hansen's disease? The disease was the same. What changed in the naming or the renaming? Some of you may know that the disease that is called acquired immune deficiency syndrome or AIDS was named so only in 1982. In 1980-81, when the disease first emerged in the United States, it was given a different name officially. It was called gay-related immune disorder or GRID. Popularly, as Trump called COVID-19 the Chinese virus, so popularly, especially by the homophobic leaders of the United States, it was called WOGS, W-O-G-S, the wrath of God syndrome. God is angry with these homosexuals because God made Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. And therefore God was killing off these homosexuals, and is therefore no concern for the state. You know that the Reagan administration took absolutely no steps, not even funding research on AIDS, till I think that the death of his friend, the actor Gary Cooper, of AIDS, which was 1986, 1985 or 1986. So you see, the naming of a disease is not immaterial. I mean, literally, it has material consequences. It is not immaterial to the way we understand and respond to the disease. In fact, Charles Rosenberg, who I will be citing in a short while, has this very interesting essay called Disease in History, Frames and Framers. where he says it's as if a disease does not exist till it is given a name, until its meanings are constructed through the name. So, to return to my presentation, and I begin with by citing Charles Rosenberg again from a different essay. Medical historian Charles Rosenberg writes in an essay called What is an Epidemic? Writes that an epidemic becomes meaningful in terms of a three-part construction: its outbreak and official recognition as epidemic, the explanatory frames that make it comprehensible, and the strategies by which it eventually comes to be contained. That is, the acknowledgement of outbreak, the explanations of the epidemic, and its strategic containment. These are the three stages. A recurrent way in which an epidemic outbreak comes to be understood is as a crisis of public health infrastructure, a social, political, and economic crisis, and an existential crisis. It calls for extraordinary measures on the part of public authorities, which may be unwarranted in ordinary times, but become justified by the urgency of epidemic crisis. Some of these measures result in the suspension of legal safeguards against arbitrary authority, while some legitimize the intrusion of the state into the privacy of its subjects. An epidemic, in other words, is a crisis that blurs the distinction between public and private, and between what the law can circumscribe and what it cannot. Distinctions on which the politics of the liberal state is founded. It is in this zone of indistinction, to use a phrase made current by the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, it is in this zone of indistinction that the cultural politics of epidemic finds its play. If we come to think about it, Rosenberg's three-part schema is about the unfolding of an epidemic event on two levels: the level of discourse and the level of practice. Explanatory frames are discursive constructions of the event, its cause or etiology, what it signifies, how it spreads, how it can be controlled, what effects it has had in the past, and how these can be countered in the present and the future. Broadly speaking, explanatory frames are of two types: biomedical and cosmological, or what Rosenberg calls, and I quote, rationalistic and quote unquote spiritualistic. Biomedical frames construct epidemic as a natural event subject to the environmental and pathogenetic laws of nature, requiring interventions that are based on the rationality of these laws. Cosmological frames, in contrast, construct epidemic as the outcome of supernatural forces, which may be a deity or a dead ancestor punishing the community for a wrong committed in ritual observance. Redressal takes the form of expiatory rituals, which, if performed properly, can ensure the appeasement of the deity or the ancestor and the end of epidemic. A good example of this is the tradition of disease goddesses in India, like Sitala and Mariamma, associated with smallpox, Ola Bibi or Ola Chandi, associated with cholera, and Bombay Mai and Urama, associated with plague. Quite often, it is not the deity who causes the epidemic, but protects her worshippers from it. In June, and I'm sure some of you must be aware of this, in June, when the spread of COVID was at its peak in India, there were reports from across the country of people worshipping a deity called Corona Devi in Assam, in West Bengal, in Uttar Pradesh, in Madhya Pradesh, in Bihar, in Kerala, in practices that were spontaneous and widely dispersed. In Asansol, West Bengal, where a group of women were performing rituals of the goddess Corona Devi, one of the devotees narrated how she had appeared in the forest in the form of a cow and instructed the people to worship her as she could protect them from the epidemic. It is easy to dismiss this as ignorant superstition, as the media reports invariably did. But the pertinent question is, what prompted people scattered across diverse communities, not communicating with one another, so it's not a pre-planned thing. What prompted people scattered across diverse communities to perform the worship, and what function is it supposed to have served? As crisis events, epidemics generate fear and uncertainty, which cannot be sufficiently addressed by biomedical explanations. Culture, as a repository of a community's practical knowledge, or a knowledge arising from what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls the habitus. Culture includes traditional schemas for comprehending epidemic crisis that serve to allay the fear and uncertainty it generates. The effectivity of ritual worship, as Marcel Mauss says of magic in that excellent short book called uh, uh, A General Theory of Magic, Marcel Mauss says that the effectivity of ritual worship is of an order different from that of natural causation. Or as he puts it, it's an effectivity that is sui generis, an effectivity unique to magic and magical worship. Cosmological explanations construct epidemic as a sign of cosmic disorder or as a disturbance of the relations between the community and its gods, the community and the spirits of its ancestors, and rituals bring about a restoration of order. Rosenberg's point about explanatory frames is that they serve to provide practical strategies for dealing with epidemics and their effects. These strategies, whether they are rational or spiritual, whether they are medical or cosmological, take a ritual form as schemas of social action that are transposable from one context to another. This is how I define the ritual. Schemas of social action that are transposable from one context to another, providing ready-made ways of dealing with a crisis. On this view, according to Rosenberg, quarantine measures and the wearing of masks are functionally no different from the liturgical rituals of Corona Devi or Sitala or Mariamma. For they serve the same function insofar as culture is concerned. And that is, to quote from him, the visible acting out of community solidarity. The performance of these forms of collective action reinforces belief in their effectivity, whether naturalistic or supernatural. And the beliefs in turn, I quote from Rosenberg, promise a measure of control over an intractable reality. What we can infer from this argument is that epidemics become socially meaningful and manageable in the way we both represent them and respond to them through collective practices. The cultural politics of epidemic unfolds in this intersection of discourse and practice, a point that I made at the beginning when I was talking about what cultural studies is concerned about. The cultural politics of epidemics unfolds in this intersection of discourse and practice. Cosmological explanations serve to reinforce traditional norms, violations of which are held to be the cause of epidemic. Biomedical explanations legitimize the intrusion of the state's public health apparatus, extending power over its subjects, as we have seen in the COVID epidemic, extending power over its subjects in unprecedented ways. Epidemics, in other words, serve as a site of power relations and aid in entrenching, as anthropologist Mary Douglas argues, and I quote from her, entrenching the hierarchy of social categories, whether these are traditional or modern. The individuals or groups that are suspected to harbor infectious disease and thereby cause quote unquote insidious harm are most often those who belong to already vilified categories. As Douglas puts it, and I quote two sentences from her book, this is from Risk and Blame. It's an essay titled Witchcraft and Leprosy, Two Strategies of Social Exclusion, from the collection of essays called Risk and Blame. So Douglas writes, quote, awareness of insidious harm arouses public concern on behalf of the public good. According to how the public good is conceived, accusations of causing insidious harm will be aimed at different targets. Thus, in the COVID epidemic, we saw how Muslims became the target of intense policing and stigma following the Tablighi Jamaat issue. Labeled, and I quote, Corona jihadis, members of the sect who had attended the meeting at Delhi were projected as anti-nationals, and the names of those who tested positive were put up on public display in Uttar Pradesh. Similarly, in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, sex workers were rounded up and detained in remand homes even after they tested negative. In 1997, when middle-class housewives started testing positive for HIV in significant numbers, an India Today cover story declared, and I'm quoting from that story, the killer, that's HIV, the killer that prowled red light areas and seedy highway dhabas is now stalking bourgeois neighborhoods and beginning to attack conservative households. Prostitutes, it stated, are, and I quote from the report, from the story, a major reservoir for the AIDS virus. And it becomes a matter of grave national concern when the virus crosses the quote unquote border and passes into the valued middle class bodies. In other words, epidemics as social crises open up already existing fault lines in the name of a public good that is predicated on structures of dominance and exclusion. As we have seen in the COVID epidemic, the state intervenes in epidemic crisis in two ways. One is through the apparatus of law and order, by the coercive imposition of sanitary rules and quarantine. Scenes of the police beating up, and this is something I'm sure all of you have seen on YouTube, scenes of the police beating up and publicly shaming lockdown violators have been widely circulated in YouTube videos in what is literally a striking display of the authority of the state. My favorite video is one in which policemen in Orissa lined up people who were moving on the roads without masks. They lined them up on the roadside, put placards around their necks as badges of shame and displayed them before a jeering public. So this is one way in which the state intervenes in the lives of its subjects. The other way in which state power intervenes seems more benign and concerned for the welfare of the people, and therefore more difficult to identify as power. I am referring to campaigns of awareness creation, which teach people how to protect themselves against disease. Pedagogic power, which is the power exercised by these campaigns that teach, pedagogic power follows a logic quite different from the coercive. It seeks to inculcate in people a self-discipline that appears to be in their interest besides being in the interests of the state. It relies on persuasive rather than coercive force, which is why the law is not its chosen instrument. Michel Foucault calls this mode of exercise of power, quote unquote, governmentality, the objective of which is to make subjects self-responsible. It is the preeminent way in which the liberal state works in the fulfillment of its biopolitical function, even as it resorts to illiberal strategies against those who violate its order. Epidemics, as I have repeatedly said, are understood as critical events and are used as such, as critical events, to justify this double deployment of force, both persuasive and coercive. Governmental power, unlike juridical power, that is the power of law, governmental power, unlike juridical power, does not act on us merely as the objects of its exercise. It also, in the process, constitutes us as subjects. Foucault defines the subject as the outcome of two linked processes. The subject is one who is simultaneously subjected to an authority and, as he puts it, tied to its own identity by a conscience or self-knowledge. If on the one hand, pedagogy subjects us to the state's authority, on the other, it transforms us into what may be called the prudential subjects of epidemic. Prudential based on a calculation of risk. What may be called the prudential subjects of epidemic politics. By inculcating in us the aspiration to stay safe and healthy. Conscience and self-knowledge that Foucault refers to. This is what the language of risk, which informs all health awareness campaigns, whether it is AIDS or COVID or heart disease or nicotine addiction. This is what the language of risk underlines. We must learn what the risks are and how best to avoid them, or to at least minimize them if not avoidable. We learn to wear masks and to maintain social distance, to abstain from casual sex, or to wear condoms instead, to quit smoking, to exercise, to eat healthy foods. The point is not that these are bad. The point is not that these are bad. They're certainly very good, certainly very important if we wish to stay healthy and well. And that's why they disguise themselves as not an exercise of power. But nevertheless, in ways much, much more invisible than the coercive exercise of power. The coercive exercise of power is sensational, dramatic, public, and therefore eminently visible. Its visibility is what guarantees its effect. It is the visibility, the spectacularity of the juridical exercise of power that impresses itself on our minds. Whereas pedagogic power is far more invisible, far more insidious, in the way in which it extensively penetrates our bodies in the form of an aspiration that comes from within. The obverse of this pedagogic power, as Louis Althusser says of ideology, is the deployment of the repressive apparatus. In my sketchy outline of epidemic as social crisis, I have tried to indicate how a cultural studies approach works. It analyzes the meanings that culture brings to bear on the event, the ways in which we represent and comprehend it, and drawing on concepts it takes from social theory, it brings to light the power relations that such meanings make possible and justify. Cultural studies enables us to understand how we are placed in these networks of power that simultaneously objectify and subjectivize us. Let me return now to the rhetorical question with which I began. Faced with the outbreak of a life-threatening epidemic, of what value is the work of cultural studies? In critiquing the cultural politics of epidemic crisis, we cannot intervene in its material conditions directly. Yet, we can see how those conditions are both made and unmade by the social contexts in which they happen. If cultural studies is relevant to our present crisis, it is because it points to the possible transformation of those contexts that construct it as crisis in the first place. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. So, before we begin the question, I have a question of my own. So thank you for such a elaborate discussion where you talked about the cosmological explanation, the biomedical explanation. You also touched upon Foucault and Agamben, and Agamben had written about the state of exception, and I had come across this article where Agamben had started talking about the COVID-19 crisis, and he started talking about how there was a rise in the state of exception, where a context like this of the COVID-19 gives a state a certain authority to impose certain politics. So what I was also wondering was how do you look at the technocratic politics? Like if you also remember, like ever since the COVID-19 came, there was this idea of uh, the different apps that used to or that we use for surveillance, like the Arogya Setu app and all those kind of apps where there was a like almost of a tracking of sorts of our behavior and how we interacted. So what do you think about this rise in technocratic politics of during the COVID-19? Because I found it very relevant in the yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the ways in which this intrusion into the personal lives of people happen. That's one of the ways in which the very carefully built up distinction between the personal and the public, the private and the public, on which liberal or a neoliberal governmentality relies. That's the way in which the distinction becomes blurred. Now, as far as the question of technology is concerned, I think one of the things that we need to examine is the different roles that technology has played in the present crisis. It has become, digital technology has become extremely important because without it, we cannot have certain forms of communication that are absolutely necessary. Like, for example, online teaching, like, for example, webinars. All this would not be possible without that technology. Well, this was always there, even before the technology was there before COVID-19. But you know that we did not have to rely so extensively on it because we could have face-to-face interactions. Now that face-to-face interactions, the sociality that constitutes the human world is rendered at risk in the COVID epidemic. The safe mode of communication is what we may call a digital sociality. So we see how the technology actually enables something that epidemic endangers, something that epidemic places at risk. And what is that? Communication. Interestingly, epidemic diseases are also called communicable diseases. The way in which epidemics bring to the fore this very paradoxical relation between communication, communicability of disease, and community, the coming together in a collective solidarity. The way in which epidemic actually brings to the fore these complex paradoxical relations between these, I think, is very explicitly underlined by the use of digital technology. Digital technology has also, as you very rightly pointed out, played another significant role. Digital technology has made it possible to extend power in the name of biopolitics, in the name of the politics of life, has made it possible to extend this power in ways that were hitherto never adopted. Not that the ways did not exist, not that the digital technologies did not exist, but COVID became an opportune moment because it seemed justifiable to extend the networks of power in unprecedented ways into the bodies of the state's subjects. Now, what Agamben had written about COVID was, as you know, contested by the other members of the panel, especially Roberto Esposito, who was also a very, very significant philosopher as far as biopolitics is concerned. He wrote a very well-known trilogy, Bios, Immunitas, and Communitas. And Esposito's response to Agamben was that this is a kind of exaggeration. It's a kind of exaggeration that Spain and Italy are not yet the camp, are not yet the camp. Uh, that while that may be so, I think the point that Agamben was trying to make was not to kind of over dramatize and exaggerate the implications of the governmental role in the epidemic. The point that he was trying to make was to shock us, to startle us into looking a little more closely at it. Sometimes when you wish to draw attention to something that is obvious and therefore not acceptable, the way to do it is through exaggeration. The way to do it is through over dramatization. And I think it was more of a technique that Agamben was using rather than actually literally comparing Italy or Spain to Nazi Germany and its internment camps. So I gave you a very, very long answer, but I hope I answered your
Yeah,
question.
thank you, sir. Like now, Dr. Amitava would like to ask you a question. If he can unmute himself and ask the question directly.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Professor Das.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you.
So actually, I have two questions. These are, I'd like to frame those even as comments, uh, because you have talked about of what you have talked so far. Say, if we talk about this particular project, the hastiness that is involved in this project to academically capture the disease and crisis from a particular disciplinary background, which, as you have already noted, doesn't directly contribute materially in the crisis, in resolving the crisis. How would you look at it from the Althusserian perspective, which you have already referred to? Um, there have been quite a few webinars which try to deal with the disease. Most of those webinars were around earlier diseases and in general terms, epidemics in human history, etc. This project uh, specifically tries to deal with COVID-19. So the way we are trying to capture the disease academically, how would you look at it? Second is, I think compared to our previous epidemics, this is different in its digitality, which has not only made, like, I mean, quarantines are supposed to stop communication, whereas in our case, this case, quarantine has not totally blocked communication. Because of digitality.
It has led
Yeah,
to its reverse,
yeah.
an
Now,
epidemic of communication.
yeah. Now, the fact that this communication, though the platforms often are official, the communication is happening from home, which is usually private. What do you think would be the implication in the ontological understanding of this mixing of private and public? These are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Both the questions are actually very, very crucial, very insightful questions. Let me first respond to the first one. I think what you said was, how do we make sense of this from the perspective that Althusser provides? You may have noticed that I really did not draw much on Althusser. I am not really an Althusserian in that sense. I don't quite agree with Althusser. In the way in which he actually gives a kind of singular role to ideology. Foucault's rejection of Althusser's thesis on ideology, which is widely known. He says in Power Knowledge, in one of the interviews in Power Knowledge, he says there's no such thing as ideology. It doesn't really mean that there's no such thing as ideology. He says what we should be actually asking is not ideology, but how does real knowledge, scientific knowledge, how does knowledge extend relations of power? How does knowledge provide the technologies, both technologies literally like digital technology, technologies in a wider sense as coherent set of techniques? How does knowledge enable the technologies of power? And how does the exercise of power corollarily require the production of more knowledge? Foucault replaces Althusser's ideology with this copula of what he calls power knowledge, pouvoir savoir, power knowledge. And I find that more convincing. Not that ideology does not exist. Most often Foucault does acknowledge the role of ideology. But I think there are two problems with the concept of ideology. One problem is the one that Althusser himself points out in the essay. The assumption that ideology is false consciousness. That doesn't really quite explain why people behave the way they do. And that's the problem that Althusser himself points out. And that's why in another essay, he says that, this is I think from the book For Marx, he says that ideological consciousness is not an unconsciousness. It's a different kind of consciousness. It's a consciousness that we take as unconscious. So it is a consciousness in the sense that it is neither true nor false. That is why Althusser very carefully chooses a particular word in defining ideology. Where in Ideology and Ideological State Apparatus, as he writes, and I think I'm quoting his words, ideology represents the imaginary conditions, represents the imaginary relation between ideology represents the imaginary relation of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Now, what do we have there? We have first the term ideology is representation. Ideology is discourse. Ideology is the way in which we construct our world. Ideology is a representation. Second point, ideology is an imaginary representation, neither true nor false. Althusser is using the word imaginary in a double sense. First, in the more general sense of neither true nor false, things that are imagined. So we don't say a novel is false or a poem is false. Imaginary works have a truth of their own. A truth that we may call, following Marcel Mauss, that is sui generis. He's also playing on another meaning, though strangely he does not acknowledge that yet, of the word imaginary, which he takes from Lacan. Imaginary on a psychoanalytic register, image, representations that deal with image. And he's using this psychoanalytic meaning of the word imaginary extensively towards the later part of the essay when he's talking about mirroring and all that. The reference is very clearly there to Lacan's essay on the mirror stage. Now, so the question of ideology first has this problem of false consciousness, and ideology is not a false consciousness. The second problem, I think, that the question of ideology poses is that it actually, posits as the opposite of ideology, knowledge. So there is on the one side ideology, which is not false consciousness, but a certain mode of knowing. And there is on the other side a correct mode of knowing. Now, how does one know? From which location does one know that that is the correct mode of knowing when Althusser says that we are all always within ideology? Ideology, he says, ideology, like Freud's unconscious, has no outside. There is no outside to ideology. Nobody is outside ideology. In fact, in an essay on humanist Marxism, he writes that even socialism is an ideology. Communism is an ideology. This is in the context of claiming that humanist Marxism is an ideology. Humanist Marxism is not Marxist science. Of dismissing humanist Marxism, Althusser was a structuralist Marxist. So that is a problem, an epistemological problem, not a problem of definition, as in false consciousness, but an epistemological problem. So, from what vantage point do we know what is ideological and what is non-ideological? The question is, this distinction between ideological and non-ideological, can it itself become an instrument of power? I think that is a very crucial insight that Foucault is opening up for us. But the distinction between ideology and the ideological and the non-ideological actually becomes one of the ruses of power. Foucault's account of power is that power is, power strategies are very cunning. They co-opt the very things that were put up in resistance to them. So I think I am suspicious of the ideological analysis, where ideological analysis is the only perspective that is being offered. In that sense, when we are making the distinction between the ideological and non-ideological, what is it that we are installing on the pedestal of truth? And what kind of politics underlies this installation? So Althusser, as far as the ideology thesis is concerned, while the concept of ideology is certainly very important, absolutely important. I mean, we've seen the functioning of a certain kind of ideological nationalism that both lay behind and also determine the course of the Tablighi Jamaat issue. So it's not that there is no ideology. There is no such thing as ideology. Ideology does not have a role. But we should also at the same time look at the function that, say, technological knowledge, digital technologies, non-ideological in that sense, the ways in which they also extend relations of power. And that is where the distinction between the ideology and knowledge, I think, is where the question of pedagogy comes in. In my work on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, one of the things that I constantly came up with is, can you actually analyze all the pedagogic material, the AIDS awareness campaigns, as being determined by ideology? Some you can, and I did in my book. But there are many you can't. There are many you can't. I mean, they're based on hard scientific facts. But the way they work is the larger context within which these scientific facts are embedded. The context within a discourse of knowledge, a discourse of objective knowledge, comes to disguise the effects of power. But at the same time, I think Althusser's argument about the ideological and the repressive is a very crucial one. which is why I actually referred to Althusser when I was talking about the way in which uh, law and pedagogy, law and governmentality function in the extension of epidemic politics. Uh, the question of repression uh, is one that is, I think, very crucial, especially in regimes that do not appear repressive, especially in regimes like the liberal or the neoliberal. I think that is one of the limitations of Foucault's analysis of modernity. It's quite clear that Foucault, gives repression and coercion a lesser role, largely as a result of his opposition to the overvaluation of ideology in Marxism. His emphasis on power as productive rather than repressive is very clearly a response to his teacher, Althusser. Very clearly a response to and a critique of or dismissal of the Althusserian notion of power. But in doing so, I think Foucault kind of overstates the case for the productivity of power. One of the things that Foucault points to it often, points to it in an essay, for example, an essay like The Dangerous Individual, about the concept of the dangerous individual in 19th century legal psychiatry. Or in the last lecture of the collection of lectures published as Society Must Be Defended, where he talks about the enigma of biopolitics. Foucault certainly points to that, but Foucault was never actually interested in uncovering the illiberalities of the liberal state. Foucault was, all his effort went to uncovering the disguises of power in the liberal state, but not to the illiberalities of the liberal state. That job, I think, was completed by Agamben, whose Homo Sacer begins where Foucault's argument on modernity ends. So I think it is necessary, which is why actually I draw on both of them. I draw both on Foucault as well as Althusser, not in this talk because of given the time frame, but extensively in my work on epidemics, I draw on both. I think we can very productively combine Althusser's argument about repression and ideological persuasion, and Foucault's argument about governmentality in trying to understand pedagogic forms of power. As far as that is concerned, I think Althusser's comments on the school in the essay Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, the function of pedagogy, his comments on the school, I think are very crucial in trying to understand this form of power which disguises itself as not power. I don't know, I hope I've answered that first question. Your second question was...
Okay, so there are a couple of questions in the chat also, like there's some very insightful questions in the chat, right? Okay, so we have like half an hour more to go, right? So
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you can also mail Amitava sir, and probably you can have a conversation there also.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So we have a question from Kanchi who says, how does religious institutions and leaders of minority religions use the technocratic space and the government's institutions to build on the hegemonic practices, especially during a pandemic, and how methodology can we study that apparatus?
Sorry, I didn't get that question. Can she clarify a little?
Kanji, would you like to qualify that question?
Clarify, not qualify.
Yeah, clarify that question. Sorry. Okay, I can read that question again if you want. Okay, Kanchi is here. Okay.
So I was asking, like, I am working on the Jan community response to COVID-19 in India. So what I came across in the initial findings was like religious, like Jans, supported or use the platform to talk about their religion and to amplify it in like wearing masks. Like Jans always preferred using masks, and
Hmm,
and some sanitation practices as well. So
hmm,
this was like in a closer ambit or in a very small ambit. So and we are talking about other religious minorities in India as well. So what I want to understand is how do the government's apparatus, I'm not particularly talking about the ruling party's apparatus, right, like in the current situation, but as you talked about um, Trump calling the virus as Chinese virus. So how do we understand, like, how do religious minorities, the leaders of religious minorities, use this technocratic space and the government institutions to build on, to amplify the hegemonic practices that are uh, are in circulation, to talk about the practices like you talked about, like having a healthy diet and all those things. And how can we study those, like especially when this, as Amitav sir pointed out, this the quarantine is not it has not left us in quarantine as per se. We are still talking, and with the medium of the internet, we are aware of everything happening across the world, and also we are in touch with everyone else. So how is that apparatus used, and what methodology can we use to study that? Thank you. I hope I'm clear now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, no, I must be very honest. This is not something that I can really speak on or clarify now, because I don't want to make some very broad, general comments which would be relevant. I mean, this is something that I do not know enough about. So I don't think I can actually uh, talk about this or answer your question in any meaningful way, because I don't know how the religious minorities actually used these technologies or the government apparatus. I can see the point about, which is something I read about sanitary procedures and the wearing of masks and the Jain community's support of that. Uh, uh, where see, one of the things that we need to understand is that I mean, although I have in my presentation talked about the state, is that the exercise of power is not the prerogative of the state. The exercise of power, especially in contemporary times, is carried out by a very large number of non-state actors, like NGOs, like community organizations, like housing societies, which have played a very prominent role in the COVID epidemic, and which is what Foucault calls the spreading of governmentalization. In fact, his definition of governmentality is not a state-centered definition of governmentality. Governmentality is a mode of exercise of power that may quite often be under the auspices of the state, but its functionaries are not necessarily state institutions. Functionaries are not even necessarily institutions. The family is also a site of governmentality. So the internet is a site of governmentality. Social media is a site of governmentality. These are not necessarily on the initiative of the state. So, and the relations between these points of articulation of power, the state and all the other non-state, is a very complex one and would need to be studied specifically. See, I think, I don't know whether I made this point clear, but I think what is crucial to cultural studies is context. I did talk about it at the beginning when I mentioned Lawrence Grossberg, and that is also, if you'll recall the way I ended my talk. I can read that line again. If cultural studies, we can see how these conditions are both made and unmade by the social contexts in which they happen. If cultural studies is relevant to our present crisis, it is because it points to the possible transformation of those contexts that constitute it as crisis. Cultural studies is context bound, context specific, and therefore these are processes that we cannot generalize about. The point I'm trying to make is that one would actually need to study this in much greater detail than I have. The role of minority leaders, for instance, in order to understand what is the relation between these minority leaders or minorities institutions and the state, in what ways these collaborate with or complement the state exercise of public health authority, in what ways do they challenge or deviate from. It would need to be a much more contextual reading. I haven't been very helpful, but I hope I have responded acceptably to your question.
Thank you, sir. Now we have a question from Deepthi Chawla. It's a long question, so would you like to ask it like by unmuting yourself or?
Sure. I'll do that.
Yeah.
Thanks. So, hello, sir. Thank you so much for sharing such insights into the role of the state and how state kind of perpetuates. So, my concern here was that on one hand, we have the state apparatus, both public, both coercive as well as persuasive. But it got me thinking that this kind of an apparatus, though we did not give it that name till the time, let's say, Althusser or Bourdieu came in, this kind of a apparatus has always existed. Like it's always been there, some way or the other. And then if we now look at the whole pandemic situation, now in this kind of a situation, in general, we also need some kind of a control, someone who is helping people control the spread, or how do I phrase it? Like some kind of a support structure, a system which sort of ensures that, let's say, the pandemic doesn't spread, or it doesn't really affect as many people as it could have. And then how do you then propose, when the state is entering, or the state is actually minimizing the public private divide, especially with respect to the individual, then how to sort of look at the evolution of the whole system, or the whole structure of the state itself? Do you see, and it's largely in respect with a system like, let's say, democracy. On one hand, we have had countries like or places like Saudi Arabia, which were able to control the pandemic very quickly, and which are definitely not democratic states. And on the other hand, we have democratic states where the spread was massive. And on the other hand, we also have media which kind of controlled the spread of information. Now, so within all this, do you see that the role of state eventually would be evolving into something else, or would be reverting back? And I'm talking this with respect to what Niti Aayog's chairperson recently, like in last month, kind of shared that India is not able to kind of take any decisions because there is too much democracy, quote unquote. So in this whole scenario, and also in this scenario, there is also this other point that, you know, none of us are equals. Someone is always talking from the position of privilege, someone is always talking from the position of capital, whether it is cultural capital or whether it is capital as we understand capital. So how do you see the evolution of state in this whole paradigm?
Yeah, let me see if I have understood your question correctly. One, you say that the various measures that have been introduced in the name of the epidemic have also succeeded to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where these measures were introduced, what kind of a state or what kind of a government. They've also succeeded in some ways containing the epidemic, in some ways preventing people from getting infected. So one question perhaps would be, how then do we respond to this? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should we be critical of a state that is doing this? Then I think the second question that you asked, drawing on your example from Saudi Arabia, and the allusion I think was to the United States, the democratic government. Does this mean that in a pandemic situation, states would turn more totalitarian? Would democracy be seen as a kind of weakness or
Right.
a deficiency on the part of the state in functioning to control an epidemic? Am I right? Are these the two questions?
True. Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
well,
Thanks.
as far as the first one is concerned, see, I think what we are trying to do is an analytics of power, not a polemics of power. What we are trying to do is to study the way in which different forms of power come to be deployed and coherently organized in an epidemic, and what institutional functions thereby come into force in this context. It is one thing to analyze, it's another thing to value, that is, place value, evaluate. This is good, this is bad. I don't think the task of inquiry or the task of critique is to do that. The task of critique, which is what we are attempting, is to bring to light the forms of exercise of power, and not the question of whether this power is good, whether the power is bad, because that question will involve your own standpoint also, your own political or polemical standpoint. What would appear to be a good exercise of power to you, maybe I would try to persuade you that it is actually a very evil and malignant exercise of power. So I think the task before us, before we go on to make value judgments, is first to study these networks of power relations. How does epidemic become the site for such a network? That would be my response to the first question. Not that questions of good and bad are irrelevant, but questions of good and bad have a place of their own. critique is not, I think, about questions of valuation. Critique is an attempt to bring to light that which is not invisible. I mean, that which is not visible. To bring to light that which is deformed, unformed, and misrepresented, etc. To respond to the second question, see, you might have noticed that the point I was trying to make was that the question is not democratic versus totalitarian. I think as long as we are proceeding with that dichotomy, democracy versus totalitarian, we are forgetting a very important ways in which some of the most liberal democracies today have functioned in absolutely blatantly illiberal ways. You know the way our liberal or neoliberal democratic state has functioned with regard to the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. God knows how many. You just, National Security Act. You know the way in which the neoliberal democratic United States functioned in Guantanamo. So I think this whole distinction between democratic, undemocratic, democratic, totalitarian, the politics of the right, the politics of the left. I think we should start beginning to question this. And to not think of a trajectory or a grand narrative of the evolution of the state, but to understand how the state does not evolve. The story of evolution is a myth of progress that has been debunked for ages. We stopped thinking of the evolution of states. We, I think, need to think of the ways in which states manifest their authority in very contingent ways, no longer as a kind of grand project of the state, evolving from this stage to next stage to next stage to next stage, and so on to utopia. I think we need to see how states contingently respond to crises. Foucault has this very wonderful chapter. I forget which chapter. The chapter in his collection of lectures called Security, Territory, Population, which were lectures that he gave at the College de France. This is a chapter on what he calls coup d'etat, C-O-U-P-E''T-A-T, coup d'etat, which is the seizure of the state, the coup of the state. Foucault is talking about two things there, two fundamental kind of principles of the politics of the state: the raison d'etat, the reason of the state, and the coup d'etat, the seizure of the state, which is not, as he makes it very clear, which is not a rebel regime taking over the state, which is the state's own seizure of society, which is when the state, which the rationality of which is liberal politics, founded on the concept of the liberty of the individual. That's where the word liberal comes from, the liberty of the individual. Where the state founded on the principle of liberty becomes illiberal in order to save itself. And I think perhaps the best example of this is national emergency. The national emergency of 1976. And so I think it's very necessary to understand that states don't function either as liberal or illiberal. This binary is very unproductive. It's very important to see how illiberalities are the complement of the liberal exercise of power. I think this is perhaps the most important insight that we have in Agamben's Homo Sacer. Homo Sacer is not about Nazi Germany. It's only superficially about it. Homo Sacer is about the power of the state to determine who lives and who dies. Homo Sacer is about the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of a nurse who was brutally gang raped and left unconscious, remained in coma for, I think, 30 years. Homo Sacer is about the Supreme Court judgment of 2011, Aruna Shanbog versus the Union of India. Homo Sacer is about the Kerala High Court judgment that denies to a person who has petitioned the court the right to take his life. This man, known as Thomas Master, petitioned the Kerala High Court saying that he has lived his life to the full. He now has grandchildren who are grown up. His family is well settled. He has fulfilled all his commitments to society, to his family, and he wishes to die a dignified death. The Kerala High Court turns down his petition. I think he then goes to the Supreme Court, but by the time the Supreme Court order comes out, ironically, Thomas Master has died a natural death. So I think it's necessary to kind of shift our perspective from this unhelpful binarism of democratic, undemocratic, liberal, illiberal, and to see how states function in the interstices of the two. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Thank you so much for responding to it, sir. I mean, these are questions that really do not have a final or a fixed answer. As you also said that it's not about looking at the binary between a totalitarian or a democratic government. So what I was actually thinking about was how the government itself can evolve. So I don't know, I'm not even thinking as a chronological evolution of how different governments have evolved, but how in general public life affects the changes in governments, and how it all, I mean, these are just ideas. So thank you so much for sharing your views on it. Kind of put things in perspective, and thanks.
So we have one more question from Anidhi Patnaik, who gave a talk on this platform before. So her question is, she says that thank you for such a rich discussion on the cultural constructions of COVID-19. It conversed really well with the talk I presented on social constructions of productivity and precarity during lockdown. I particularly appreciated your classification of the pandemic under medico-biological and cosmological perspectives. Perhaps you could shed some more light on the subject construction under the cosmological. Even as you said with AIDS and WOGS, this is clearly a residual part of our culture that has become dominant through this crisis. Since COVID is fatal more in terms of its transmission than mortality, how do older concepts of karma, guilt, and accountability resurface in our culture with respect to the deceased, disabled subject versus the healthy, able subject? So that is her question.
to be very honest, I'm not sure how I would answer that question, because that's a very, I mean, it's not just one question, it's a whole complex of questions that you raised. Let me begin with the first point about the cosmological and subject formation. Yeah, I did not really go much into the question of the cosmological and subject formation, because it's the biomedical that is more relevant to epidemic unfolding in the context of the series of epidemics that we have had in the last 30 years. And we've had more than our fair share of epidemics, SARS, Nipah, you name it, you have it, since 2003. Now, the question of the cosmological and the way it shapes subjectivities or personhood, I think one obvious thing that comes to mind is the relation between cosmological explanations and the social norms that prevail in a community that subscribes to the cosmological. See, the rituals of worship are always public. Shitala is never worshipped privately at home. In fact, the temple of Shitala stands at the entrance to the village. And the worship of Shitala is performed collectively by everyone. Now, subjectivities are not constituted by discourse alone. That is the view of social construction, which has proved to be inadequate. Subjectivities are constituted equally by practices. They're constituted by practices. They're not just constituted by what we say, they're also constituted by what we do. And it is in doing, in these practices, that we become the kind of person we are. It is these practices that actually constitute our belongingness to a community. These practices, especially in societies or communities where a cosmological notion prevails, these practices are linked to a very important way in which persons are conceived or persons are conceptualized in such societies, which, in contrast to the notion of the individual as person in the West, has been called individual personhood, partible personhood, permeable personhood, individual personhood. Mackim Marriott, for instance, Andrew Stewart and Pamela Strathern, Mark Moscow, much of the work on what is called New Melanesian anthropology. So that is a very, very long question. I don't want to really go into the details. I've just given you some hints as to what that would entail. We would need to look at this formation. I will give you an example from the work that I did, which you may find very interesting. In 1998, when there was a sudden increase in cases of HIV positivity in South Karnataka, around Mysore, in South Karnataka, the people of a village called Mensikyatanahalli, which is about 40 kilometers from Mysore, set up a shrine to a goddess they called AIDS Amma. Now, this shrine was not actually first set up by the people. It was set up, the whole idea was that of a local school, government school science teacher, a man called Girish, who had just been posted to Mensikyatanahalli. And he learned about a case of stigmatization where a couple, a childless couple, were deprived of their livelihood. They had a small eatery, and people stopped coming to their eatery when it was known that they were HIV positive, as a result of which they took their lives. And the people of the village, because of the stigma and fear, pushed the bodies using bamboo poles into a pit dug in the ground, poured kerosene over them, and burnt them. But there was a lot of unease because they had not performed the right karma. They did not give them the right, the funeral rites correctly. cremation rites correctly. Now that's what Girish learned when he came to this place. And he thought that it was a ripe occasion for him to create an AIDS awareness campaign to teach the people. So he mobilized the support of his students, recruited them as volunteers. They went around all the villages, collected a good number of people, and he started with his PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoint presentation, is the in thing nowadays. So he started with this PowerPoint presentation, and you can imagine what the people of the village were doing. They were obviously yawning and looking this side and that side. So the second or the third time he held such a meeting, there were just 2 or 3 people apart from his own students. And he was absolutely fed up. So he thought of giving up this attempt. Then he noticed that there was a temple of Mariamma at the entrance to the village. And every Friday, a lot of women would go there. So then an idea struck him. He said, why not set up another temple? So under a neem tree, he installed a milestone and painted it and all and wrote on it, Aidsama. And then the women started coming. They were curious. They came and they asked, what is this? He said, this is a new goddess, Aidsama. Now, what happens if we worship her? Will we not get AIDS? He says, no. You will not. It's not that she will protect you from AIDS. Now, next to that shrine, there was a water tower on which he had his students write in very simple Kannada messages about HIV. What is HIV? How is it transmitted? How can it be prevented? Why there is no cause for stigma, etc., which he had taken from a booklet of the World Health Organization. So he told these women, look, you do the puja and you read that. Instead of chanting shlokas, you have to read that. And when you read that, it somehow will give you the knowledge that will help protect yourself from disease. And that's how the worship of Aidsama began. And this went on every Friday. They would come. And on World AIDS Day, December 1st, they would have an Aidsama Jatra. They would take another icon of the idol and a procession perambulating the village. And as Jatra is performed for all the disease goddesses, for Mariamma, for instance. So then gradually, of course, now what happened was about 4 or 5 months into all this, the people of a neighboring village came in the night and destroyed that. They broke the stone and destroyed the shrine. And next morning when Girish and the others saw this, Girish was absolutely disheartened. And he said, I'm just giving it up and it's not possible to do anything, so I don't care. It was the villagers who said, we will contribute. We will install another shrine. We will guard it. We will perform the puja. You just have to give us your support. And that's how the shrine, which exists still now, the new shrine, came into being. It was no longer Girish's. It now belonged to the people. It was no longer an initiative from a science teacher. It now became appropriated as the initiative of. Now here we find two very strange things. One is a cosmological explanation, an Amma who presides over the disease. The other is a biomedical explanation, the WHO statements. How do these come together? These absolutely incompatible explanatory frames. How do these come together in shaping this popular initiative? How do people become certain kinds of subjects of knowledge, cosmological, biological? How do people become certain kinds of subjects of knowledge in the acts of liturgical worship, in the liturgy of Aidsama, the religious rituals of Aidsama? Girish actually names this. He has written it on the stone, Girish names it, gives it a very, very, oxymoronic name. He calls it scientific temple. It's written there. The words are written there on top of it. Scientific temple. And when I spoke to him, and we were talking over 2 days about this 8 Sama shrine and how it came into being, and he was talking about how he obviously gave more importance to the science part of it than to the temple part of it. And he said that my understanding, my vision is that religion should be re-articulated, translated, transformed into something that is rational and scientific. The question of whether that's possible or not is a different one. So you see how cosmologies also shape subjectivities. Cosmologies do not shape subjectivities in terms of individual autonomy. See, pedagogies, biomedical pedagogies shape your subjectivity in terms of individual autonomy. What all the behavior change campaigns do is that they tell you, you are an autonomous individual. You have reason. I'm giving you all the information. Use your reason. Make the right choice. There is a campaign about AIDS awareness called the ABC campaign. A stands for abstain, meaning if you are not married, abstain from sex. B stands for be faithful. If you are married, be faithful to your spouse. C stands for use condom. If you cannot abstain, if you cannot be faithful, then use a condom. What D would stand for is anybody's guess. To me, I think D stands for death. You don't do all of these, brother or sister, whoever you are, the fourth option that you have is death. Now you see how these are structured. These are structured as free options, free choices. You choose A, fine. You choose B, fine. You can't choose A and B because your compulsions are too much. You choose C, perfectly all right. You choose D, that's also fine. I mean, D is not there. D is something I'm putting in there. But you choose D, that's also fine. It's your death, brother. So this question of autonomy, choice, the individual person, is how these pedagogies actually shape subjectivities. Cosmological pedagogies do the reverse. They shape subjectivities in terms of individual personhoods, collective personhood. Now, regarding the other parts of your question, I really am not very sure of an answer, honestly. I could think about it. Maybe we could continue that over email, the conversation.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I invite Dr. Amitava to give vote of thanks.
Well, not really a vote of thanks. I mean, that sounds too formal. Professor Das, it has been really a very insightful session for us. It was like, for me, it was like attending a class after a long time when a teacher begins with basics and then takes you to formulations where you want to read more and get yourself involved. As part of this project, this has been helpful, I think, for us to understand that we are trying to, how we are looking at it, the theoretical backgrounds of that. I think I'll soon write to you, actually
Certainly.
inviting for a few other, your comments on the project, and also I have a few other things to discuss and seek your advice on. I would, okay, there is one point I would like to inform that we are actually in touch with a biologist, Alpana Pudrai, to look at this disease from biomedical history. Let's see how it shapes up. But of course, I think one is that I think our participants have found this immensely helpful, and we'll be in touch with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm happy that you found this useful. I was not very sure because these are very cursory remarks that I
Oh,
kind
no,
of
these are
hurriedly put
really very
together.
helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm
Thank you
glad
so
you
much, sir.
found it.